He was humiliated, slapped, and told he didn't look first class. But when this quiet black man reached into his jacket and revealed a Navy SEAL badge, everything changed. What began as a single act of racial bias exploded into a reckoning that exposed systemic racism buried deep in the airline industry, from selective enforcement to HR stonewalling, biased evaluations, and years of complaints from minorities silenced by corporate spin. In a world where discrimination hides behind professionalism, where workplace racism is normalized by culture, not policy, this story confronts the raw truth. Real power doesn't shout, it dismantles systems from within. More than revenge, this is a story of transformative justice. A story where prejudice meets quiet leadership. Where one man's dignity forces an entire corporation to answer for decades of injustice. Because until there is equal treatment in every cabin, every boardroom, every so-called professional environment, there is no true equality. And justice must keep flying forward. His boots didn't belong in first class. Not the kind you lace in silence. Not the kind dusted in red earth. But that's what made them stand out as he walked through gate B-17. A tall black man, broad shoulders under a worn grey Henley, sleeves rolled. Calm. Still. The kind of still that unnerved people. Not because he moved. But because he didn't. The gate agent scanned him twice. First his boarding pass. Then his face. A pause. Not long enough to be called racist. But long enough to be felt. She forced a smile. "Welcome aboard, sir." He nodded once. No need to smile back. His seat was 1C. First row. Aisle. Across the cabin, polished heels clacked toward him. The flight attendant's uniform crisp. Hair tight. Her eyes said she'd already decided he didn't belong. He slid into his seat, shoulders relaxed, spine tall. She didn't offer him a drink like she had the white couple across. Didn't offer water. Didn't offer anything. Just a look. Then it came. "Sir," she said, leaning in close. "I need to see your ticket again." Her voice sweet sharp. Too polite. He handed it over without a word. She looked at it. Then looked at him. "You're in the wrong seat." He didn't flinch. "No. I'm not." A beat of silence. A second attendant approached, young, uneasy. Whispered something in her ear. She waved her off like smoke. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to the back," she said louder now. A white man across the aisle glanced over. Phones didn't come out yet, but attention was sharpening. Still, he didn't raise his voice. He reached into his bag slowly. Pulled out a sealed envelope. Slid it across the tray table. "Is this a threat?" she snapped. "Why are you handing me something?" Her tone cracked. Volume rising. He stayed quiet. The envelope was unopened. Stamped with an insignia she didn't recognize. But it looked official. She slapped the envelope off the tray. It hit the aisle. A quiet gasp from somewhere behind. Then she slapped him. Not hard enough to bruise. But hard enough to shock. His head turned slightly. But his eyes never left hers. He didn't stand. He didn't speak. He just reached again, this time beneath his jacket. Security began to move down the aisle. The captain's voice crackled faintly overhead. Passengers leaned into tension, unsure who was right. But then he placed the badge on the tray. Flat. Centered. Cold metal. A Navy SEAL insignia. Her eyes widened. The younger attendant whispered again. This time, she listened. Her face changed. Color drained. She didn't kneel. Not yet. But her hands shook. And when she picked up the badge with trembling fingers, she realized what she'd done. He looked past her, to the seatbelt sign. Still lit. Still waiting. Like the silence in the cabin. Like the justice that hadn't arrived yet. But it was boarding. And it was on time. The boardroom smelled of cedar polish and shame. The airline CEO stared at the paused video on the screen, frame by frame, the slow-motion slap, the stillness of the man's jaw after impact, and the ripple of silence that followed in the cabin. "God," one executive whispered. "He didn't even flinch." "He didn't need to," the CEO muttered. "He let the world see." The HR director cleared her throat, visibly sweating. "We've pulled her file. Several soft complaints, nothing official. But it's clear this wasn't isolated." A silence heavier than steel dropped over the table. Then, the general counsel finally said it. "This is no longer about employee misconduct. This is about corporate culture. We have a racial bias problem, and now the whole world knows it." At 37,000 feet, the man sat quiet again, arms crossed over a chest that held more restraint than rage. A child across the aisle looked at him like he was a superhero. He offered a small nod, then closed his eyes. He remembered the time his orders got delayed because a base clerk didn't believe he was a SEAL. His team waited on a tarmac while he stood, humiliated, outside a restricted gate, showing badge after badge to skeptical eyes. He'd laughed it off that day. Said, "Hey, it happens." But it never stopped happening. One time, during a covert assignment, a junior officer called him transport staff. He outranked the man by 4 tiers. Another time, an admiral asked where the real commanding officer was. They always assumed he couldn't be in charge. Not him. Not a black man. And still, he served. When he opened his eyes, the flight was landing. Police stood at the jet bridge. But this time, they weren't there for him. They nodded. Respectfully. One even saluted. She was escorted off the plane. The attendant. Head down, no eye contact. As she passed him, the silence said everything. In the terminal, passengers gathered. Some wanted autographs. Others just wanted to say thank you. One woman, mid-40s, corporate badge swinging from her lanyard, stood trembling. "I filed a complaint last year," she said quietly. "They buried it. She told me I didn't look like I belonged in executive class." He met her eyes. "You do now." A younger man stepped forward. "Sir, I'm in HR at another airline. What you did, it's going to ripple. We've been afraid to speak up. You just made it safe to start talking." News crews swarmed. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. His silence had shouted louder than any speech. By evening, the airline announced a full internal audit on workplace racism, a partnership with civil rights groups, and a resignation from their head of cabin services. Still, none of it felt like justice. Until his phone rang. A quiet voice, older. "I saw the footage. I trained with your father." He froze. "Your father told me once, if my boy ever has to fight this fight too, I hope he fights it with dignity. He'd be proud of you." He stepped outside the terminal and looked up at the darkening sky. He remembered something his father used to say. True equality doesn't just mean you get a seat at the table. It means they stop questioning why you're there. Later that week, he stood in front of a board of directors, not just of the airline, but a National Aviation Council. They invited him after public pressure. They asked what they could do differently. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply described what it felt like to live under selective enforcement, to be judged before credentials, to survive systems that weren't built for people like him. When he finished, no one clapped. But everyone stood. A week later, the airline launched the Transformative Equity in Aviation Initiative, a program aimed at rooting out systemic racism across hiring, training, customer service, and executive culture. And in the quiet of his own home, the man removed his badge one last time, not out of shame, but because he no longer needed it to prove he belonged. The world had finally seen. And now, maybe, just maybe, it would start listening. The media storm hadn't passed, it had only evolved. What started as a viral clip of violence had transformed into a national conversation. Not just about one flight, or one slap, but about every unseen slap that went unrecorded. Every raised eyebrow in a boardroom. Every time someone was told, without words, you don't belong. He wasn't trying to be a symbol. That's what made him powerful. They asked him to speak on morning shows. He declined. Not out of anger, out of purpose. I don't want a headline, he told his sister over the phone. I want change. But not everyone saw it that way. A smear blog surfaced. Old photos, twisted narratives, anonymous sources trying to frame him as aggressive, unprofessional, dangerous. He read them. All of them. Then he smiled. Because he recognized the playbook. Character assassination, the first move in every system that fears accountability. But this time, receipts were everywhere. Footage. Testimonies. Military records. Letters of commendation. Years of service. Truth outshone lies. The airline quietly fired from mid-level managers after internal reviews revealed patterns of biased evaluations, selective promotion practices, and unofficial flagging of black passengers as security concerns. A memo leaked. Dated 2 years prior. HR warning that certain staff disproportionately target minority travelers in premium cabins. It had been ignored. Until now. And still, he said nothing. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about reconstruction. One day, his niece called him. She'd been watching the news at school. "Uncle," she said, "my teacher said you're what leadership looks like." His voice cracked. "No, baby. I'm what accountability looks like. Leadership is what comes next." The attendant? She disappeared from the headlines. But not from consequences. She faced a formal federal investigation after 2 prior complaints, both buried, were re-examined. Patterns emerged. Racial profiling. Emotional intimidation. A private suit was filed by another black passenger. He never contacted her. Never even saw her again. But he hoped she changed. Not to redeem herself. But so no one else would have to feel what he felt, sitting in that first-class seat, watching a system ask for credentials while the slap still rang in the air. One day, a letter arrived. No return address. Just a single sheet of paper. I was on that flight. I didn't speak. I should have. I watched you show restraint that changed my life. I work in corporate DEI. And I realized I'd been quiet too long. You woke me up. Thank you. He folded the paper. Pressed it to his chest. He remembered his first day at BUDS, the brutal SEAL training program. A white recruit spit in his direction. Later, he'd broken down in the barracks. One instructor had found him. "Son," the man had said, "the system might doubt you, but pain don't care what color you are. And neither does strength." He'd carried those words like armor. Now he was giving them back, to a world that needed to hear them more than ever. He didn't expect the documentary. It wasn't his idea. It wasn't even about him, really. It was about what happened after. High school students watching the flight footage in civics class. Corporate policy reviews rippling through industries. A law school professor building an entire module titled Systemic Racism and Professional Environment around the moment one man refused to be reduced to a seat number. He was invited to speak at the Naval Academy. He declined. Then a letter arrived, this time, from a cadet. "My father said you were his commanding officer. He said you taught him about silence and power. I wanted you to know I carry that with me." He went. Not for the medal. Not for the applause. But to sit quietly in the back row and watch a room full of future leaders discuss racial bias in chain of command structures, and how leadership must look different now. His niece, now in college, wrote a senior thesis titled Selective Enforcement, The Psychology of Prejudice in Professional Environments. She dedicated it to him. His own son, 10 years old, stood in front of his class for Black History Month. "I'm proud of my dad," he said. Not because he's strong. Because he stayed calm when people tried to make him small. There were whispers that the airline might name a new internal policy after him. A symbolic gesture. He refused it. Said no name should be attached unless it came with transparent reform. Instead, he met privately with executives and insisted on something better: minority-led advisory boards, third-party audits of racial profiling complaints, and a public tracker of workplace discrimination outcomes. It passed. Then came the unexpected. An elderly white man stopped him outside a cafe. He looked nervous. "Sir, I don't mean to intrude. But I was raised different. Saw the world different. When I saw what happened to you on that plane, I thought I could have been the one swinging. I've changed. Because you didn't." He didn't know what to say. So he nodded. Sometimes change speaks in silence. His former SEAL unit sent a plaque. Not military-issued. Hand-carved. It read, "True strength is the power to absorb injustice and still move the world." Years later, a new airline worker, young, black, soft-spoken, approached him in an airport. "I memorized your story in training," she said, eyes glistening. "They said you helped rewrite the manual. You made us visible." He smiled, eyes tired, heart full. Because he understood something now. Justice isn't a moment. It's a movement. And movements live in the hands of the young, those bold enough to imagine true equality, and those wise enough to remember what silence used to cost. So he boarded his flight. Not as a symbol. But as a father. As a leader. As a man who sat in first class once, got slapped, and didn't rise with anger. But with vision. And changed the air for everyone who would come after. What happened on that flight wasn't just about a seat, a slap, or a badge. It was about how power moves in silence. How racism, prejudice, and systemic bias can be stitched into the fabric of our everyday spaces, even 30,000 feet in the air. But this time, a black man didn't explode. He endured. He revealed. And he transformed not just the policy, but the people. Because justice isn't loud. It's deliberate. It's patient. And when it's done right, it echoes. So if this story moved you, don't just watch. Speak. Share. Subscribe. Because somewhere, someone is still being told to move, to shrink, to stay silent. And maybe this story will remind them. You are not alone. You are not invisible. And your dignity is not negotiable. Comment below. Have you ever experienced or witnessed racism or workplace discrimination that went unchallenged? How did it change the way you see power and justice? Let's talk about it. The comments are yours.